Operation Midnight Climax, LSD, secret safe houses, and mind control. The world was steeped in shadows. It was a time of secrets, a time of quiet warfare fought not with guns and bombs, but with whispers, deception, and silent games played behind locked doors. The Cold War had settled over the world like an unshakable fog. Two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, stood on opposite sides of a vast ideological divide. Each nation was a mirror to the other, reflecting the same fears, the same ambitions, the same desperate hunger for control. It was not enough to have the most powerful weapons, the most advanced technology, or the strongest armies. The real battleground lay in the human mind. There were rumors, deep, unsettling whispers that drifted through the halls of intelligence agencies, whispers of a new kind of warfare, one that did not rely on brute force, but on the manipulation of thought itself. Somewhere in the Soviet Union, it was said, scientists were conducting experiments on the human psyche. They were searching for a way to break the human will, to bend thoughts like metal beneath a hammer. Some claimed they had already succeeded, that deep in hidden laboratories, prisoners had been turned into puppets, their minds stripped clean, their actions controlled like marionettes on invisible strings. And if the Soviets could do it, what stopped them from doing it to American soldiers, American citizens? This was the fear that gripped the CIA, the fear that the enemy had discovered something far more dangerous than nuclear weapons, the ability to control a person's very thoughts. The United States could not afford to fall behind. If the Soviets were unlocking the secrets of the mind, the CIA had to go further. They had to experiment, study, and push the boundaries of human consciousness, no matter the cost. What if there was a drug that could unravel the deepest secrets buried inside a person's mind? What if there was a substance that could dissolve loyalty, erode resistance, and make a person spill their secrets like water slipping through fingers? What if the key to mind control was a chemical, and all they had to do was find the right one? And so, in the dimly lit offices of CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, a plan began to take shape. A plan that would blur the lines between science and madness, between research and cruelty. This was MK Ultra. It was not a single experiment, but a vast web of covert projects, each one more secretive than the last. Some focused on electrical stimulation of the brain, others explored hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and psychological torture. But one branch of MK Ultra would take a different approach. Instead of laboratories and controlled environments, this experiment would unfold in the real world. Bars, hotels, brothels, places where people let their guard down, where their inhibitions faded into the night. Instead of trained test subjects, the participants would be ordinary citizens, unknowing, unprepared. And instead of doctors in white lab coats, the experiments would be conducted by spies, con men, and criminals. This was Operation Midnight Climax, a program so strange, so audacious, that it would become one of the most surreal experiments in the history of espionage. It would begin with a man named George Hunter White, a man who straddled the worlds of law enforcement and crime, a man whose love for deception made him the perfect recruit. And in the neon-lit haze of San Francisco's red light district, behind closed doors where secrets were traded like currency, the experiment would begin. Unseen, unchecked, unimaginable, the birth of Operation Midnight Climax. The world of espionage is built on deception. It thrives in the shadows, where truth bends, where loyalty is negotiable, and where men who understand corruption become its most valuable architects. To run an operation like this, to build secret rooms where minds would be manipulated, where men would be watched like test subjects without their knowledge, the CIA needed someone different. Not a scientist, not a bureaucrat. They needed someone who understood vice, understood temptation, and knew how to pull the strings of human behavior without hesitation or conscience. They needed George Hunter White. George Hunter White was a contradiction, a man who lived both inside the law and outside of it. A veteran of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, he had spent years hunting drug traffickers, going undercover in the seediest corners of society. He had the look of a man who had seen too much, heavy-set, with a weathered face and cold, assessing eyes. He moved between criminals with ease, blending into their world, learning their secrets and taking them down when the time was right. But White was not just a lawman. He was something else, a man who relished power, who enjoyed the darker side of his work, who had, over time, become more comfortable in the world of crime than in the world of justice. He didn't just chase criminals, he lived among them, adopted their ways, spoke their language, and perhaps, somewhere along the way, he stopped being able to tell the difference between them and himself. When the CIA approached him, they knew exactly who they were dealing with. A man who could lie, manipulate, and operate in the shadows without hesitation. A man who had no moral objections to what they were about to ask of him. The assignment? Set up secret locations where the CIA could test LSD on unknowing civilians. Observe them, manipulate them, gather data on how the mind unravels. There would be no rules, no oversight, no one to stop him. And for George Hunter White, it wasn't just a job. It was an invitation to indulge his darkest impulses under the protection of the U.S. government. He accepted, and with CIA funding, he began creating his playground of deception. The first safe house was established in San Francisco, hidden in the city's red light district, an area pulsing with life, neon lights flickering in the fog, where desperation and pleasure existed side by side. On the surface, it was just another apartment, ordinary, unremarkable, a place where no one would look twice. But inside, it was something entirely different. The walls held secrets, hidden microphones, recording devices, and the most crucial piece of surveillance, a two-way mirror. Behind that mirror, George Hunter White would sit, a glass of gin in one hand, a notepad in the other, watching, taking notes, studying the effects of LSD on the unknowing men who entered. The second safe house was established in New York City, following the same formula. Ordinary on the outside, a psychological testing ground on the inside. But a room alone wasn't enough. White needed bait, and so he recruited prostitutes. Women who knew how to lure men in, how to make them feel at ease, how to keep them distracted while their drinks were laced with a dose of LSD slipped in without their knowledge. The setup was perfect, a trap where the prey never even realized they were being hunted. George Hunter White loved his work. To him, it wasn't just an assignment. It was an experiment in control, a game of power where he held all the cards. He decorated the safe houses himself, filling them with an odd, almost theatrical aesthetic. Lurid artwork on the walls, a bed with red silk sheets, bottles of expensive liquor arranged like a stage prop. The safe houses didn't look like laboratories. They looked like fantasies designed for indulgence and vice, because that's exactly what they were. A place where nothing was real, where everyone was a subject, where the line between science and voyeurism blurred. White did more than just watch. He drank, he participated, he revealed in the experiment. And as the men under his surveillance fell deeper into LSD-induced hallucinations, he leaned back in his chair, smiling to himself, jotting notes about their unraveling minds. Because in these rooms, he was not just an observer. He was the puppet master. The CIA wasn't just experimenting with drugs. They were experimenting with the very concept of control. Could a man be made to confess against his will? Could loyalties be broken through chemical manipulation? Could LSD become a weapon of war, used to dissolve the mind like acid on metal? These were the questions that Operation Midnight Climax sought to answer. And in these hidden rooms, as ordinary men were lured inside, dosed without consent, and studied from behind glass, the answers slowly began to take shape. In the daylight, the buildings looked ordinary, just another row of apartments lining the streets of San Francisco and New York City. The kind of places where people lived and worked, where strangers passed without a second glance. But behind those doors, beyond those walls, something else existed, something hidden, something carefully constructed, something designed for deception, These were the safe houses of Operation Midnight Climax, a world that blurred the line between pleasure and surveillance, between indulgence and control. A place where men walked in unaware, their fates already decided the moment they stepped inside. The moment you entered, the outside world faded away. The rooms were dimly lit, bathed in the soft, flickering glow of neon signs from the streets below. Heavy drapes covered the windows, shutting out the noise of the city, sealing the world inside. The air was thick with the scent of perfume, cigarette smoke, and expensive liquor. Music played from a small radio in the corner. Slow, sultry jazz, the kind that drifted through the air like a whisper. But beneath the surface of warmth and indulgence, something cold lurked. Hidden behind the walls, microphones recorded every word. From the ceilings, cameras captured every movement. And behind a two-way mirror, an unseen figure sat in the shadows, watching. A glass of gin in one hand, a notepad in the other. George Hunter White. The safe houses needed bait, women who could draw men in, make them feel safe, make them drop their guard, and so White recruited prostitutes, women who knew how to navigate the world of temptation, how to spot a lonely man, how to play the role of a perfect companion. They were paid well, very well. Their job was simple. They found men, strangers passing through the city, businessmen drinking alone, drifters wandering the bars and clubs. With a practiced smile and a soft touch on the arm, they whispered invitations. "Let's go somewhere private." And so the men followed. Up the narrow staircases, past doors with peeling paint, into rooms that smelled of whiskey and forgotten secrets. They sat down. They relaxed. And then, the real experiment began. The setup was always the same. A bottle of bourbon poured into crystal glasses. A moment of laughter, a clink of drinks, a sip, a pause, a conversation beginning to blur at the edges. What they never noticed, what they couldn't notice, was the colorless, odorless liquid that had already slipped into their glass, a small but powerful dose of LSD. And as the minutes passed, as the conversation drifted, so too did reality itself. The room tilted slightly. Shadows seemed to move where they shouldn't. A thought that made sense one moment unraveled the next. And somewhere in the haze of confusion, a new kind of fear took root. Through the two-way mirror, George Hunter White sat, waiting. This was his domain, a place where he was not just an observer, but a puppeteer pulling unseen strings. He leaned back in his chair, watching as the men inside began to change. One by one, they fell into the grip of LSD. Some laughed uncontrollably, spilling half-formed confessions to the women beside them. Some became silent, eyes wide, staring at walls that seemed to breathe. Some panicked, stumbling backward, whispering about unseen figures watching them. They were right, of course. Someone was watching. White took notes, detailed notes. Subject appears increasingly paranoid, speeches fragmented, rapid transitions between laughter and panic, eyes tracking movements that do not exist. He watched them dissolve, and he enjoyed it. For George Hunter White, this wasn't just an experiment. It was performance, a test of how far the mind could be pushed before it broke. A world where secrets were extracted in the haze of hallucination. And the most disturbing part, none of these men would ever know what had been done to them. By the time morning came, it was over. The men awoke somewhere else, a hotel room, a cab, an alleyway. A hangover pounded behind their eyes, but something felt off. The night before was a blur. The memories were fractured, strange, missing pieces. They had met a woman, hadn't they? They had gone somewhere. But the rest? Gone. Maybe it had just been the whiskey. Maybe they had imagined things. Maybe it had all been a dream. That was the beauty of Operation Midnight Climax. The subjects never knew they were subjects, and the world went on, unaware that somewhere in the city, hidden behind closed doors, the CIA was playing with the boundaries of human consciousness. A secret world built on deception. A theater of espionage hidden in plain sight. A game where the players didn't even know they were playing, the experiment's unknowing subjects and altered realities. There is a moment just before sleep where the edges of consciousness begin to blur, a place between waking and dreaming, where thoughts drift, untethered, where the mind struggles to hold on to reality only to feel it slipping through its grasp. For the men inside the safe houses of Operation Midnight Climax, this feeling did not come from sleep. It came from something far more sinister, a chemical, unseen, already coursing through their veins. At first it was subtle, a strange warmth spreading through the limbs, a slight distortion in sound, voices stretching, slowing, then snapping back into place. Then the world began to shift. Shadows on the walls seemed to move, though nothing had changed. The room itself felt like it was breathing, expanding and contracting in slow, rhythmic waves. And somewhere, beneath the music and the laughter, beneath the taste of whiskey on their tongues, beneath the perfume lingering in the air, a sense of unease began to bloom. Something wasn't right. Something was wrong. The women beside them smiled, but the smiles felt too wide, like masks stretched over something else. The jazz music in the background warped, melting into a distant, echoing sound, as if coming from another room, another world. When they stood, the ground beneath them tilted. The floorboards seemed to ripple like water disturbed by an unseen force. They tried to focus. They tried to think. But thoughts would not stay still. A single idea would enter their mind, take shape for a moment, then break apart like shattered glass, scattering into 100 tiny fragments, each one slipping through their fingers before they could piece it back together. Time itself began to fracture. One moment they were sitting at the table, laughing. Then, in an instant, they were standing near the window, staring out at the city below. But how had they moved? Had it been seconds, minutes, hours? They couldn't tell. Reality was unraveling. The effects varied from man to man. For some, the trip was strange but fleeting, a night of blurred memories, odd sensations, and scattered thoughts, forgotten by morning. For others, it was a nightmare that lingered long after the drug had worn off. They walked through the city the next day, trying to shake the feeling that something had happened to them, that their minds had been altered. They glanced over their shoulders at nothing in particular, feeling the nagging sense that someone, somewhere, was still watching them. Because, in a way, they were right. Somewhere, locked away in a classified report, their names, unbeknownst to them, were written down. Notes on how they reacted, how their minds bent, how their fear took shape. They were part of an experiment they would never know about. Their names forgotten, but their minds dissected, reduced to nothing more than words on a page. It was not a single event, not a brief experiment. It lasted for years. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of men unknowingly became test subjects in a government experiment that blurred the lines between espionage and sadism. And yet, despite everything, despite the paranoia, the fear, the shattered minds left in its wake, the CIA still had no clear answers. Could LSD be used to control the human mind? Could it break down resistance, force confessions, create spies who could be manipulated at will? They didn't know. And so they kept testing, kept watching, kept playing with the limits of human consciousness, waiting for the day when they would finally find the answer they were looking for, even if it meant destroying more lives in the process. Ethical nightmare. The dark side of Midnight Climax. The men who stumbled into the safe houses of Operation Midnight Climax never knew they were part of something larger. They did not sign waivers. They did not volunteer for a study. They did not agree to be part of an experiment. They simply followed a woman up the stairs into a dimly lit room where a glass of whiskey waited on the table. And the moment they took that first sip, their fate was sealed. The CIA did not ask permission. They did not seek approval. They did not see these men as individuals with rights, families, lives of their own. They were not citizens. They were test subjects, a resource to be used, studied, discarded. And the worst part, they never knew. Most of them walked away the next morning with no memory of what had happened. They awoke in unfamiliar places, a splitting headache behind their eyes, a creeping sense that something had gone wrong. But they had no proof, no answers, just fragments of a night that didn't quite make sense. And so they went home, to their families, to their jobs, to their ordinary lives, unaware that somewhere in a locked filing cabinet, their names had been recorded, their minds dissected, their fear analyzed, their reactions scribbled in a government report. The experiment was over for them, but for the CIA, it was just beginning. Some of the men who passed through the safe houses were lucky. They woke up the next morning, shaken but intact, their minds eventually piecing themselves back together. Others were not so lucky. Some suffered lasting psychological damage, their paranoia never quite fading, their thoughts never quite settling. Some felt haunted by something they couldn't explain, a strange fear that lingered in their subconscious, an unease that crept into their dreams, whispering of a night they couldn't fully remember. There were no follow-up studies, no check-ins, no medical evaluations. The CIA did not care about the aftermath, because to them the men were never people to begin with. They were just case numbers in an experiment that never officially existed. Outside the safe houses, the world moved on. The Cold War raged. The arms race continued. Intelligence agencies worked in the shadows, preparing for battles that might never come. And behind locked doors, Operation Midnight Climax continued in silence. There were no oversight committees, no whistleblowers, no one to ask whether the ends justified the means, because in the world of espionage, ethics were a luxury. And in the eyes of the CIA, there was only one rule that mattered: stay ahead of the enemy at any cost. The experiment's downfall, exposure, and public outrage. For years, Operation Midnight Climax remained invisible, hidden beneath layers of deception. The safe houses stood in silence, their doors closed, their secrets locked away. The men who had stumbled inside, who had been drugged and watched, went on with their lives, never knowing what had been done to them. And behind the walls, behind the mirrors, the watchers continued their work, taking notes in the dim glow of the surveillance room, until, one day, the truth began to slip through the cracks. Secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of surfacing. It began with rumors, strange, disconnected stories told in hushed voices by men who couldn't quite remember what had happened to them. A businessman in San Francisco, convinced he had been drugged during a night out. A drifter in New York, certain he had been followed, watched, used for something beyond his understanding. A handful of former government employees whispering about classified projects that had gone too far. At first, no one paid attention. The stories sounded like paranoia, like delusions, until journalists began to dig deeper, until they found patterns, connections, strange funding trails leading back to the CIA, until they began to ask questions the government did not want to answer. The 1970s were a dangerous time for secrets. The world was changing. The old walls of trust in government institutions were beginning to crack. The Watergate scandal had shattered public confidence. The Pentagon Papers had exposed government deception on a massive scale. And in the wake of these revelations, journalists and politicians began demanding answers about what else had been hidden from the public, and so the U.S. Senate launched a historic investigation into government abuses of power. It was called the Church Committee. And it was during these hearings that the world first heard the name MK Ultra. On a quiet morning in 1975, in a packed congressional chamber, the truth of CIA mind control experiments was spoken aloud for the first time. Before the committee sat former CIA officials called to testify under oath. Their voices were calm, their words were measured. But what they revealed sent a chill through the room. They spoke of secret drug experiments, of human subjects dosed with LSD without their consent. They admitted that entire lives had been altered, memories stolen, realities manipulated. And somewhere, buried within the testimony, the name of Operation Midnight Climax was mentioned. A program that had taken place not in laboratories, not in controlled environments, but in the real world, on real people, without their knowledge or permission. The senators listened in stunned silence. The journalists in the room wrote furiously, realizing they had stumbled upon one of the darkest government secrets ever uncovered. And outside, across the country, the American public was left in shock. The government had drugged its own citizens, had spied on them, manipulated them, studied them like test subjects, had used prostitutes, hidden safe houses, and secret surveillance rooms, all in the name of national security. It sounded like fiction, but it was true. The full extent of Operation Midnight Climax should have been revealed in those hearings, but it wasn't, because by the time the Senate began its investigation, the most damning records were already gone. In 1973, just 2 years before the hearings, the director of the CIA, Richard Helms, gave a quiet, devastating order: destroy everything. And so, thousands of classified MKUltra documents were fed into paper shredders, burned, erased from existence. What survived were only fragments, enough to confirm that Midnight Climax had existed, enough to hint at the horrors that had taken place, but not enough to paint the full picture. The CIA had done what they did best. They had covered their tracks. And because of that, we will never truly know how many people were experimented on, how many lives were altered, how many minds were fractured, or how far Operation Midnight Climax really went before it disappeared into history. For a while, the scandal burned bright. Newspapers ran headlines of mind control experiments, of secret safe houses hidden in plain sight. Citizens demanded accountability, justice, consequences. Politicians gave long speeches about transparency and government oversight. But like all scandals, it eventually faded. The outrage turned into whispers. The whispers turned into silence. The CIA moved on, shifting its focus to new threats, new secrets, new operations hidden behind locked doors. The world, as it always does, forgot. Reflection. The legacy of Operation Midnight Climax. The rooms are empty now. The beds have been stripped, the two-way mirrors removed, the last of the surveillance equipment taken down long ago. The safe houses that once hummed with secrets, with whispered confessions, with the quiet unraveling of minds, are gone. And yet, even though the buildings no longer stand, the ghosts of Midnight Climax remain, because some things, some secrets, never truly disappear. In the end, Operation Midnight Climax was never about science. It was never about understanding the human mind. It was about control. The belief that with the right tools, drugs, deception, manipulation, the government could reach inside a person's mind and turn it into a weapon, a tool, an instrument of their design. But what they failed to realize was this: the greatest danger was never the drug itself. The greatest danger was the men who thought they had the right to use it. When the truth of MKUltra and Midnight Climax was revealed, it left a wound in the fabric of public trust. People looked at their government differently. Because if the CIA had done this, if they had spied on their own citizens, drugged them without consent, erased memories, manipulated minds, what else had they done? What else were they still doing? A new paranoia took root, one that would never fully fade. And from that paranoia, new fears were born. Mind control, surveillance, psychological warfare. The fear that even in moments of privacy, someone, somewhere, is watching. What we know about Midnight Climax today is only a fraction of the truth. The most damning evidence was destroyed before it could ever be seen. The most disturbing confessions were erased before they could be spoken aloud. Which leaves us with one final, lingering question. If this was the experiment they admitted to, what else remains hidden? How many more classified programs exist, sealed in government vaults, waiting for the day they are finally uncovered? How many more operations buried in history were even stranger, even darker than Midnight Climax? Because if we have learned one thing from this story, it is this: what we see is only ever the surface. And beneath that surface, the real secrets still wait to be found. The world is filled with mysteries, waiting to be uncovered. And somewhere in the quiet corners of history, the truth still lingers. Project Azorian, raising a sunken Soviet submarine. The ocean is a world without memory. It does not keep records, it does not tell stories. It only takes. Ships vanish beneath its surface, their hulls swallowed in an instant. Cities once full of life rest in silence at the ocean floor, lost to time. And on March 8, 1968, somewhere in the endless Pacific, the ocean took one more secret. A Soviet ballistic missile submarine, armed with nuclear warheads, encrypted codes, and untold intelligence, was sinking. The Cold War was not just a war of nations, it was a war of shadows. A war where battles were fought in the unseen places of the world, in whispered conversations, in hidden rooms, in the deepest trenches of the sea. The United States and the Soviet Union watched each other from afar, preparing for a war that neither side wanted to start, but both feared might come at any moment. And beneath the surface of the world's oceans, the real front lines lay hidden. Submarines, silent, invisible, ghosts beneath the waves. They patrolled the depths, slipping through the darkness, carrying weapons of unimaginable destruction. The Soviets had their fleet. The Americans had theirs. Each side knew that, somewhere out there, an enemy was lurking just beyond detection, listening, waiting. But sometimes, something goes wrong. And on that March night in 1968, something went very, very wrong. The submarine was called K-129, and its mission was simple. It was a doomsday machine. A Project 629, a Gulf second-class ballistic missile submarine armed with 3 nuclear warheads, patrolling the Pacific as part of the Soviet Union's silent arsenal. If war ever came, if diplomacy failed, if leaders gave the final order, K-129 could launch its missiles and erase entire cities in an instant. But before it could ever fire, before it could ever fulfill its purpose, it disappeared. There was no distress call, no warning, no sign that anything was wrong. On its last transmission, K-129 had checked in as normal. Then, silence. For days, then weeks, the Soviet Navy waited. And when the radio remained dead, they knew something had happened. Somewhere in the vast emptiness of the Pacific, their submarine was gone. The Soviet Navy launched an immediate search operation, a fleet of ships scouring the ocean, searching for any trace of the lost sub. For weeks, they hunted. The Pacific is the largest and deepest ocean on Earth, an endless shifting desert of water. And somewhere beneath that rolling expanse, K-129 lay in silence. But the Soviets found nothing. No oil slick, no debris, no floating wreckage. It was as if the submarine had never existed at all. For Moscow, the disaster was an unthinkable loss, not just because they had lost a crew of 98 sailors, not just because they had lost a nuclear-armed submarine, but because they had lost something far worse. A secret. And secrets, once lost, can be found by the wrong hands. The United States had not missed the disappearance of K-129. The CIA had been listening, watching, tracking. Deep beneath the waves, hidden hydrophones scattered across the Pacific had picked up something, a faint disturbance, a shift in the deep. Something large had gone down. And as Soviet ships crisscrossed the ocean in desperation, looking for their lost submarine, the Americans found it first. The U.S. Navy, operating in secrecy, deployed an advanced underwater listening system, one of their most classified tools. And there, in the abyssal blackness, at a depth of over 1,600 feet, they pinpointed a wreck. It was K-129, broken, motionless, resting in eternal silence at the ocean floor. A Soviet submarine, armed with nuclear warheads, holding some of the most valuable intelligence of the Cold War. And the CIA? They wanted it. The intelligence inside K-129 was beyond valuable. The Americans did not know Soviet missile codes. They did not know Soviet encryption systems. They did not know how close the Soviets were to technological breakthroughs. But now, all those answers lay beneath the waves. If the CIA could recover the submarine, if they could steal it from the ocean floor before the Soviets even knew where it was, it would be one of the greatest intelligence coups in history. The only problem? The submarine lay deeper than any wreck had ever been recovered. No human had ever retrieved anything from that depth. It was impossible, until the CIA decided to do it anyway. They called it Project Azorian, a mission so audacious, so daring, that it would become one of the most secretive and most expensive operations the CIA had ever attempted. And if they succeeded, they wouldn't just be stealing intelligence from the Soviets. They would be stealing an entire submarine, the CIA's secret plan, a mission to the ocean floor. The wreck of K-129 lay in total silence, more than 3 miles below the surface, resting on the ocean floor in the abyssal blackness where light had never touched. The United States was the only nation that knew where it was, and now the CIA had a choice to make. They could leave it there, or they could attempt something that had never been done before, a mission so bold, so impossible, that even discussing it felt like science fiction. Recover an entire Soviet submarine from 600 feet beneath the Pacific Ocean. They called it Project Azorian. The Cold War was fought in secrets, and K-129 held secrets the US desperately wanted. Inside its shattered hull were nuclear warheads, a glimpse into Soviet missile technology, cryptographic systems, machines and codes that, if cracked, could allow the US to intercept Soviet communications, classified documents, maps, orders, and operational manuals detailing how the Soviet submarine fleet operated. The CIA didn't just want the wreck, they needed it. If they could retrieve even a fraction of what lay inside, it would be one of the greatest intelligence victories of the Cold War. There was just one problem. No one had ever pulled something from that deep before. The Pacific Ocean is vast, endless, unforgiving, and K-129 was deeper than anything humans had ever attempted to recover. At 600 feet, the water pressure was bone-crushing, 700 times greater than at the surface. The temperature was near freezing, just a few degrees above absolute cold. The darkness was absolute, the wreck resting in a world untouched by sunlight. There were no submarines that could reach it. There were no diving teams that could operate at that depth. To retrieve the wreck, the CIA would have to build something entirely new, something that could reach down into the crushing blackness and pull the submarine up without anyone noticing. The CIA was no stranger to impossible missions, but this was something else. It required new technology. It required complete secrecy. It required a cover story so elaborate, so convincing, that even the Soviets wouldn't suspect the truth. And so in 1969, the CIA launched Project Azorian, one of the most ambitious covert operations in history. It would take 5 years, it would cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and it would involve one of the most unusual frontmen the US government had ever worked with. A man known for his eccentricity, his wealth, and his willingness to fund the impossible. Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes was a billionaire, a businessman, a man who had spent his life chasing grand, impossible ideas. He had built planes that defied the rules of aviation. He had financed projects that seemed absurd, until they weren't. And so, when the CIA needed a cover story big enough to hide a submarine heist, they turned to Hughes. And together they created a lie so elaborate it became reality. The CIA announced that Howard Hughes was funding a revolutionary deep-sea mining operation. The idea? A massive ship built to extract manganese nodules, small, valuable mineral deposits, from the ocean floor. A vessel capable of reaching depths no ship had ever explored. They called it the Glomar Explorer, but in reality, it wasn't a mining ship. It was a multi-million-dollar piece of Cold War deception. Inside its hull, hidden from the world, was the true purpose of the mission. A giant mechanical claw, a classified recovery system designed to reach down into the abyss, grab K-129, and slowly lift it to the surface. A deep-sea heist, hidden in plain sight. The beauty of the plan was its simplicity. Howard Hughes had always funded bizarre, ambitious projects. A deep-sea mining ship, it was exactly the kind of thing the world expected from him. And so, when the Glomar Explorer set sail in 1974, drifting slowly toward the wreck site, no one suspected a thing. The Soviets were watching, of course, but they saw nothing more than a civilian research ship conducting mining operations far from any strategic waters. They had no idea that just beneath them, in the crushing blackness of the ocean, the United States was preparing to steal one of their most valuable secrets. The Glomar Explorer reached its destination. The crew, sworn to secrecy, began lowering the massive retrieval system into the deep. Down it went, mile after mile, into the darkness, into the cold, down, toward the wreckage that had been waiting for 6 years. It was one of the most ambitious engineering feats in history, and if it worked, the CIA would pull off the most extraordinary act of Cold War espionage the world had ever seen. The engineering feat. Reaching the ocean floor, the Glomar Explorer drifted in open water, its engines silent, its mission invisible to the outside world. The Pacific stretched endlessly in every direction, an unbroken expanse of rolling waves. But beneath the ship, below the surface, beyond the reach of sunlight, something was moving. A massive mechanical claw, a device unlike anything ever built, was descending into the abyss. Mile after mile it sank, disappearing into the blackness, into the world where no human had ever dared reach before. A hidden war machine lay waiting, and now, for the first time in history, something was reaching down to take it back. The ocean at 1,600 feet is a place of absolute silence. There is no light, no sound, no movement. It is a world where nothing changes, where ships and bones and lost history settle onto the ocean floor, untouched for eternity. And yet, on this day, something was changing. A machine was coming down. A machine built in secrecy, built in silence, built to steal something that was never meant to be stolen. At this depth, the weight of the ocean was beyond comprehension. Every square inch of metal faced pressure 700 times greater than at the surface, enough to crush steel like paper, to turn a human body to dust in an instant. If anything failed, if a single joint cracked, if a single bolt weakened, the entire system would collapse, destroyed by the weight of the abyss. The engineers knew this, the crew knew this, but there was no margin for error, because at the bottom of the Pacific, waiting in the cold silence, was K-129.A, who were silent, and who would wait for no one. And after 6 years, it had been left untouched, unseen, waiting for something to bring it back to the world above. The Glomar Explorer's recovery claw was a masterpiece of engineering deception, designed to mimic deep-sea mining equipment, yet secretly built for an entirely different purpose. It reached lower, lower, until the cameras detected something through the murky blackness. A shape, a form barely visible in the deep. And then it was there. The wreck of K-129, broken, motionless, a relic of war resting in the quiet graveyard of the ocean. The moment had come. The machine extended its arms, and slowly it reached out to grasp the submarine. The partial recovery, a mission in ruins. The claw had made contact. For the first time in 6 years, K-129 moved. The recovery system gripped the wreck's shattered hull, its steel arms tightening, locking the submarine in place. Slowly, carefully, the ascent began. At the bottom of the Pacific, in the blackness where time had stood still, something was rising. The Glomar Explorer held position at the surface, its crew watching the monitors in silence. 6 years, hundreds of millions of dollars, the most ambitious covert operation in history. And now, inch by inch, they were bringing K-129 back to the world. The recovery system groaned under the strain, pulling thousands of tons of steel through miles of ocean. The ascent was slow, methodical, every movement carefully controlled. But something was wrong. The submarine had been lying on the ocean floor for years. It was damaged, weakened, corroded, and now as it was lifted from the abyss, the stress became too much. The crew felt it before they saw it, a shift in the cables, a sudden jolt in the system. Then, on the monitors, the cameras captured it. A break in the wreck. The submarine was coming apart, and there was nothing they could do. A section of K-129, possibly the most crucial part, broke loose. The crew could only watch in silence as it fell, down, back into the blackness. It had taken 6 years to find the wreck, 5 years to plan the recovery, but in a matter of seconds, half of K-129 was gone. The CIA never fully disclosed what was actually retrieved, what remained in the claw's grip when the wreckage finally surfaced. Some reports suggest they recovered only debris and wrecked compartments. Others believe Soviet nuclear warheads were secretly taken and analyzed. And some claim they found the bodies of Soviet sailors buried at sea in a classified ceremony. The truth? It remains classified. But one thing was certain. The mission was not the success the CIA had hoped for. They had reached the depths. They had touched a secret no one else had ever touched. And yet, as they looked into the water, into the darkness below, they knew that down there on the ocean floor, in the silent graveyard of lost things, the rest of K-129 was still waiting. The Glomar response, a mission wrapped in mystery. The Glomar Explorer had completed its mission, or at least what was left of it. The wreckage they had retrieved was taken in silence, its secrets locked away in classified files, and for a while, it seemed as if no one would ever know, but secrets like shipwrecks have a way of surfacing. And soon the world began to ask questions. For months, the Glomar Explorer had remained in the Pacific, claiming to be on a deep-sea mining expedition, but journalists began noticing things. The ship's movements didn't match the story. The funding behind the mission was highly unusual. And the Soviets? The Soviets had begun watching very closely. By the time the Glomar Explorer returned to port, whispers had already begun to spread. Had this really been about mining? Or had the US been after something else? The press began digging, and the more they uncovered, the more the story unraveled. They pressed government officials for answers, but when they finally reached the CIA, the response was chillingly vague. When reporters asked the CIA about Project Azorian, about the true purpose of the Glomar Explorer, they were met with a statement that would become legendary in intelligence history. We can neither confirm nor deny the existence of such an operation. It was the first time those words had been used in an official capacity, a phrase designed to reveal nothing at all. And yet, in its refusal to answer, the CIA had confirmed something far more powerful, that there was indeed something to hide. The Glomar response became the CIA's go-to answer for sensitive subjects. It was used in court cases, government hearings, classified briefings. It became a way to acknowledge the existence of a secret without ever revealing what that secret actually was. And the truth behind Project Azorian? It remained buried, like the wreckage of K-129, still resting in the deep, waiting. What secrets still lie beneath the waves? The Pacific Ocean is a place of forgetting, a place where history disappears, where ships sink in silence, where wrecks crumble into dust, where time itself seems to slow beneath the weight of the deep, and somewhere far below the surface, the wreck of K-129 still waits. Officially, Project Azorian was a failure. The submarine broke apart during recovery. The most valuable section slipped back into the abyss. The mission cost hundreds of millions of dollars, with little to show for it. That's what the world was told. But was it the truth? Over the years, rumors began to circulate. Some believed the CIA did recover Soviet nuclear warheads, but never disclosed it. Others whispered that documents from the wreck were secretly analyzed, giving the US insight into Soviet naval strategy, and some even claimed that the CIA had retrieved something more dangerous than weapons: a code machine. A device that, if cracked, could have allowed the US to intercept Soviet communications, read encrypted orders, and listen to military commands in real time. But none of this was ever confirmed. Because when it came to Project Azorian, there was only one response. we can neither confirm nor deny. And so, the wreck of K-129 remains, down in the blackness, unmoved, untouched, a forgotten relic of a war that never turned hot, a machine of destruction that never fired its missiles. And somewhere down there, in the endless quiet of the deep, maybe something still waits to be found. Operation Argo, the CIA's fake sci-fi film. The air in Tehran was heavy with tension. Crowds filled the streets, their voices rising in chants. It was November 4, 1979, and on this day, history was about to change. At the heart of the city, behind high walls and iron gates, stood the U.S. Embassy, a fortress of diplomacy in a country on the brink of chaos. Inside, American diplomats worked in silence, unaware that outside those gates, the storm was about to break. Then, the gates were breached. The crowd pushed forward, a wave of bodies crashing against the compound's defenses. Gunfire cracked in the air, glass shattered, voices turned into a roar of rage. Within moments, the embassy was overrun. 52 Americans were taken hostage, bound, blindfolded, dragged into the unknown. For the United States, it was a nightmare, a crisis that would dominate world headlines, a wound in diplomacy that would not heal for 444 days. But amid the chaos, 6 Americans escaped. As the embassy fell, 6 diplomats slipped out a side door, blending into the streets of Tehran. They had no plan, no way out. Only the knowledge that if they were caught, there would be no negotiations, no deals, only execution. And so they vanished into the city, moving between safe houses, waiting, hiding. Each day that passed tightened the noose. The streets were patrolled, checkpoints were everywhere. The search was relentless. If anyone suspected who they were, it would be over. The CIA knew about the hidden 6. But rescuing them? It seemed impossible. The streets were crawling with Revolutionary Guards. The airports were under strict surveillance. Any American found would be arrested on the spot. A traditional extraction would fail if the CIA wanted to get them out. They needed a different kind of mission, something that had never been attempted before. And so, in a quiet room deep within CIA headquarters, an agent named Tony Mendez came up with an idea. A plan so audacious, so bizarre that it sounded like fiction. They would create a fake Hollywood movie and use it as a cover to smuggle the Americans out, a rescue mission disguised as a film production. A plan so absurd it just might work. The Hollywood cover story, a sci-fi film that never existed. The plan was ridiculous, which made it perfect. If the CIA wanted to smuggle 6 Americans out of Iran, they needed the perfect disguise. Something that would allow them to walk through the airport in plain sight, past guards, past security, past the very people hunting them. And so, Tony Mendez came up with a cover story so absurd that no one would ever question it. Canadian film crew, scouting locations, for a science fiction movie in Tehran. For the plan to work, the movie had to feel real, which meant the CIA had to build it, piece by piece, detail by detail, a fake film production that looked exactly like the real thing. Mendez and his team set up a real Hollywood production office, an entire studio front designed to sell the illusion. A film title: Argo. A science fiction epic. A full script, written, bound, and placed on desks. Movie posters, designed, printed, and hung on walls. Concept art, storyboards of alien landscapes, futuristic cities. Business cards, letterheads, studio logos. Everything a real film company would have. Everything the CIA needed to make the world believe. To take the deception even further, the CIA leaked details about the movie to the press. Stories ran in entertainment magazines, trade papers wrote about the upcoming film. Hollywood insiders gossiped about the Canadian crew scouting exotic locations. Every article, every whisper, every casual mention added another layer to the lie. To complete the illusion, Mendez needed a team, a cast of spies, disguised as filmmakers. Producers, CIA operatives, trained to talk the Hollywood talk. Directors, men who could walk into Tehran and convince anyone they were scouting locations. Technical staff, agents briefed on filmmaking, ready to sell the illusion. It was part espionage, part performance, and if they played their roles well, the 6 hidden Americans would walk out of Iran disguised as film crew members, with their new identities, fake passports, and a script that wasn't real. The mission was ready. The real test was coming. The team would have to fly into one of the most dangerous places on Earth, meet the escapees, and walk them out. If a single detail fell apart, if one person questioned the story, if a guard suspected anything, the mission would fail, and the cost would be 6 lives. The escape begins, entering Tehran. The mission was no longer just an idea, it was real. And now, it was time to walk into one of the most dangerous cities on Earth. On January 25, 1980, a small group of men stepped off a plane at Mehrabad International Airport in Tehran. They carried briefcases, film reels, and folders filled with production notes. They were calm, professional, confident. Just a group of Canadian filmmakers, looking for locations, for a science fiction movie. That didn't exist. Tehran was not a place for mistakes. The streets were filled with revolutionary guards, armed men who watched foreigners with suspicion. Posters of the Ayatollah hung from buildings. Propaganda echoed from loudspeakers warning of American spies. Everywhere people whispered about the hostages, the real ones. The 52 Americans still being held inside the U.S. Embassy. No one knew that 6 more were hiding, waiting, desperate, and if they were found, there would be no rescue, only execution. For weeks, the 6 American diplomats had been moving between safe houses, sheltered by the Canadian embassy. They lived in constant fear. Every noise, every footstep outside, every glance from a stranger felt like the moment they would be caught. And then, finally, a knock at the door. It was Tony Mendez, and with him, the escape plan they had been waiting for. The diplomats were no longer who they had been. They had new names, new passports, new backstories. They were no longer American diplomats in hiding. They were now Canadian filmmakers. They memorized their fake identities. They learned film industry jargon. They practiced their roles, rehearsing every detail, because if anyone questioned them, one wrong answer would cost them their lives. For the next 2 days, the escapees had to become their new identities. They had to walk through Tehran as if they belonged. They visited local markets, discussed filmmaking in coffee shops, and acted like a team of professionals searching for exotic locations. But at any moment, someone could recognize them. Someone could ask the wrong question. Someone could look too closely. And if that happened, the mission would end before it even reached the airport. Everything was ready. The plane tickets were booked. The passports were in hand. The film crew was prepared. All that remained was getting past the Iranian airport security. A final checkpoint. One last test. If they were stopped now, there would be no second chance. The airport escaped walking through fire. The day had come. There was no turning back. The escapees, now fully immersed in their roles, walked through the streets of Tehran as if nothing was wrong, as if they weren't fugitives, as if their entire survival didn't depend on what happened next. The airport was waiting. Their tickets were booked, and in a few hours they would either be on a plane to freedom or trapped in Iran, facing a fate too terrible to imagine. The airport loomed ahead, surrounded by armed guards and security checkpoints. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Posters of the Ayatollah hung from every wall. Passengers moved through the halls under the watchful eyes of revolutionary guards, and as the team stepped inside, they knew that the most dangerous part of the mission had just begun. The first test. They lined up, waiting for their turn. One by one, they approached the counter. An Iranian officer took their passports. He flipped through the pages, paused, glanced up, stared. Their hearts pounded. Had something gone wrong? Had someone tipped them off? Then, without a word, the officer stamped the passports and waved them through. The first hurdle was cleared, but the most dangerous one was still ahead. The escapees moved through the airport, heading toward the departure gate. One last obstacle, a second checkpoint. Armed guards stood at the entrance, randomly questioning passengers. The team kept moving, rehearsing their cover stories in their minds. "We're Canadian filmmakers. We're scouting locations. We'll be back soon." Then, a guard stepped forward, blocked their path, and asked to see their paperwork. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. The guard scanned their documents, flipping through the pages. His eyes narrowed. Another guard leaned in. The group held their breath. Seconds passed like hours. And then, the guard handed the documents back and stepped aside. They were through. The gate was open. The plane stood waiting. They walked the final steps, moving through the jet bridge, the tension clinging to their skin. Then, at last, they stepped onto the aircraft. The doors closed behind them, and finally, they were leaving Iran. The plane lifted off the runway. Tehran faded below them. They held their breath until the pilot made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have now left Iranian airspace." Only then did they truly believe it. They were free. And as they looked out at the clouds, at the endless sky beyond, they knew they had just escaped one of the most dangerous hostage crises in history. From classified to Hollywood, the legacy of Operation Argo. The mission was over. The 6 Americans were safe. The CIA team had vanished, slipping back into the shadows, and for the world it was as if nothing had ever happened. Because Operation Argo was not a story for the public, not yet. For years it remained a classified secret, buried deep in intelligence files. Only a handful of people knew the truth, and the world had no idea that, in the middle of the Iranian hostage crisis, a fake Hollywood movie had saved 6 lives. Tony Mendez returned to CIA headquarters in Langley. His mission had been a success. But like all CIA operatives, he knew his victories would never be known. There would be no medals, no public recognition, no headlines. Only silence. The escapees returned home, free but sworn to secrecy. The Canadian government took credit for the rescue, and the world moved on. Until, years later, the truth finally came to light. In 1997, after nearly 2 decades of secrecy, the US government declassified the files on Operation Argo. For the first time, the world learned the real story behind the mission. How the CIA had created a fake Hollywood film studio, how an entire production had been built from thin air, how a script, a movie poster, and a team of spies had fooled an entire nation. It was a story too incredible to believe. And yet, it was true. In 2012, the mission that had once been a secret became a blockbuster film. Directed by Ben Affleck, Argo brought the incredible rescue to the big screen. Audiences watched as the CIA team walked through the streets of Tehran. As they stepped into the airport, their lives hanging in the balance. As the plane took off, escaping just in time. The film won the Academy Award for Best Picture. The world was finally celebrating a mission that, for years, had never existed. But in the end, what was real and what was just a story? The film took creative liberties, dramatizing the escape, adding last-minute chases that never happened. In reality, there were no airport guards chasing the plane down the runway, no desperate phone calls at the last second, no near-miss gunfights. The truth was simpler, more careful, more methodical. The CIA didn't need a Hollywood ending, because the plan had worked exactly as it was meant to. Quiet, precise, a mission of deception, executed perfectly. The real Tony Mendez passed away in 2019, but his story, his most daring mission, lives on. A mission built on illusion, a lie so convincing it became the truth. And as history moves forward, the line between fact and fiction continues to blur. Because in the world of espionage, the best stories are the ones we will never know. Operation Gold, The Berlin Spy Tunnel. Berlin was a city of two worlds, a city cut in half, its streets divided not by distance, but by ideology. To the west, a world of freedom, capitalism, and American influence. To the east, a world of communism, Soviet rule, and iron-fisted control. Between them, a border bristling with tension, a frontier where east met west, where spies moved in the shadows, where secrets were currency, and at the heart of it all, a war that never made it to the battlefield. A war fought in whispers, in coded messages, in unseen battles of deception. This was the Cold War, and in Berlin, the stakes were higher than anywhere else. To control Berlin was to control a gateway between two superpowers. Both sides listened, watched, waited. Every phone call, every radio transmission, every whispered conversation in the dead of night could hold a secret that might change the balance of power. The CIA and British MI6 knew they needed an advantage. They needed to hear what the Soviets were saying. They needed to listen. And so, deep inside CIA headquarters, a plan was born, a plan so ambitious, so audacious, that if it worked, it would be the greatest intelligence success of the Cold War, if it worked. Because what they didn't know was that the Soviets already knew. In 1954, the CIA and MI6 devised an extraordinary plan. They would dig a massive tunnel stretching beneath the streets of Berlin, burrowing deep into Soviet-controlled territory. The objective? To tap into Soviet communication lines, to intercept their classified military transmissions, to steal their secrets without them ever knowing. It would be an engineering marvel. It would be one of the boldest intelligence operations of the Cold War. And in complete secrecy, the digging began, digging into danger, constructing the Berlin Spy Tunnel. The plan was set. The tunnel would begin on the western side of Berlin in an American-controlled sector. From there, it would stretch deep underground, burrowing beneath streets, buildings, and Soviet watchtowers. Its destination? A hidden Soviet communication hub where phone calls and military transmissions passed between commanders. If the CIA could reach it, they would hear everything. The tunnel had to be built in total secrecy, no noise, no vibrations, no signs of construction on the surface. Because above them, just feet away, Soviet patrols moved through the streets. If they heard anything, even a whisper from underground, the mission would be over. The CIA brought in engineers, excavation specialists, and intelligence officers. A secret construction site was set up in a warehouse. Equipment was smuggled in under cover of night. Dirt was quietly removed, shipped out in trucks, disguised as ordinary deliveries. The work was painstakingly slow. Each foot of tunnel had to be reinforced, strengthened, kept from collapsing under the weight of Berlin above. But inch by inch, the tunnel grew, stretching farther, reaching deeper, until, at last, it was directly beneath Soviet territory. The mission was almost ready. But something was wrong. From the very beginning, the Soviets knew. They had always known. Because before the first shovel had ever broken ground, the plan had already been leaked by a mole inside British intelligence. A man named George Blake, a double agent, a traitor. And as the Americans continued their work, unaware that their greatest secret had already been sold, the Soviets were watching, waiting, planning their next move, a doomed mission, listening to the enemy. The tunnel was finished, a passageway of steel and concrete, stretching beneath Soviet-occupied Berlin. At the far end, a hidden chamber packed with listening devices, recording equipment, and intelligence officers. For months, the Americans had worked in secrecy, and now it was time to listen. Deep beneath Berlin, inside the tunnel's hidden chamber, CIA operatives switched on their equipment. For the first time, Soviet voices filled the room, military commanders issuing orders, diplomats discussing classified movements, spies reporting back to their handlers. Every conversation was recorded, every word was analyzed, and for a moment it seemed like the operation had worked. The CIA was inside the enemy's communication system, hearing everything, stealing Soviet secrets in real time. But above them, in the Soviet offices, they were listening to. A game was being played. The Soviets already knew the tunnel existed, and they had made a choice. Instead of shutting it down immediately, they would feed the Americans false intelligence. They would let the CIA believe they were uncovering secrets, when in reality they were being manipulated. A perfect illusion. A carefully controlled deception. And as the Americans celebrated their success, the Soviets were already planning the moment it would all come crashing down. The CIA had no idea. No idea that their greatest intelligence victory was actually their greatest failure. They kept listening. They kept recording. They kept believing. Until one night, the Soviets sprang the trap. The tunnel is discovered. A public embarrassment. For months, the Americans had listened. They had recorded thousands of hours of Soviet communication. They had believed they were stealing secrets, never realizing the real deception was happening above them. And then, on April 21, 1956, everything fell apart. On a quiet night, under the cover of darkness, a Soviet construction crew arrived. They had orders to dig into the ground, right over the hidden tunnel. With picks and shovels, drills and hammers, they broke through the ceiling and accidentally discovered what had been there all along, a fully operational American spy tunnel. It was a scene made for propaganda. Soviet officers arrived in a rush, flashing lights down into the passage below. Reporters followed, cameras flashed. The operation, once buried deep in the earth, was now exposed for the world to see. When news of the discovery reached the CIA, there was stunned silence. At first, they believed it had been a genuine accident, but then the truth began to emerge. George Blake, the double agent, the British intelligence officer who had betrayed the operation before it even began. The Americans had been played. All the intelligence they thought they had stolen, it had been worthless. The Soviets wasted no time. Within hours, they broadcasted the discovery across the world. Newspapers ran front-page stories. Photos of the tunnel appeared in Soviet media. Communist leaders denounced the West's illegal espionage. What was meant to be a top-secret victory had become a humiliating Cold War failure, and there was nothing the Americans could do. The legacy of Operation Gold, a lesson in espionage. The tunnel was abandoned. The listening devices were silent. The mission, once the CIA's most ambitious intelligence operation, had become a forgotten ruin beneath Berlin. But the story was far from over, because Operation Gold would be remembered not for what it achieved, but for how it failed. The CIA had believed they were one step ahead, that they were stealing secrets, that they were winning the game of intelligence. But the truth was far more unsettling. Because in the world of espionage, the greatest weapon isn't technology, it isn't hidden microphones, it isn't tunnels beneath a city, it's deception. And in this game, the Soviets had played it better. George Blake, the British double agent, had given away the tunnel before it was even built. One man, one traitor, had undone years of planning, millions of dollars, and the work of an entire intelligence agency. It was a lesson that would haunt Western intelligence for years to come, because it proved that even the most brilliant espionage operation could crumble with a single whisper to the enemy. The Berlin Tunnel was eventually sealed and forgotten. Its passageways collapsed, its equipment removed, its secrets buried beneath the city it was meant to spy on. Today, only fragments remain, a few rusted tunnels hidden beneath the streets of Berlin, a silent reminder of a war fought in the shadows. Decades later, intelligence agencies would look back on Operation Gold and wonder what might have been. What if George Blake had never betrayed the mission? What if the CIA had succeeded in listening undetected for years? What secrets might they have uncovered? But those answers are lost to history. Because in the end, the tunnel was never really for listening. It was a lesson, a story of ambition, betrayal, and failure. Operation Paperclip, the secret recruitment of Nazi scientists. The aftermath of war, a hunt for minds. The war was over. The guns had fallen silent. Across Europe, the cities lay in ruins, buildings shattered, streets reduced to rubble. The world had seen devastation on a scale never imagined, and in the shadow of this destruction, a new war was beginning. Not with bullets, not with tanks, but with knowledge. Because in the laboratories and research facilities of Nazi Germany, the future had already been imagined. Throughout the war, Germany had pushed the boundaries of science and technology, advanced rocketry, missiles that could travel across continents, jet engines, aircraft faster than anything the Allies had seen, chemical and biological research, terrifying weapons of war. The Nazis had envisioned a future where science was their greatest weapon, and when the Third Reich collapsed, their greatest minds were scattered. Some had gone into hiding, some had been captured by the Soviets, and some were waiting, ready to make a deal with their former enemies. Because the Allies weren't just interested in defeating Germany, they were interested in stealing its secrets. And so, in the final days of the war, a race began. A race not for land, not for power, but for scientists. The United States faced a choice. The world had seen the horrors of Nazi ideology, the death camps, the forced experiments, the atrocities committed in the name of science. These were men who had worked for Hitler, for Himmler, for the SS, men who had designed weapons of war, instruments of death. Could they really be trusted? Could the US government justify working with them? But as the Cold War loomed, the question became not one of morality, but of survival. If the Americans didn't take these scientists, the Soviets would, and so, in secret, behind closed doors, the decision was made. Operation Paperclip had begun. Recruiting the enemy, a shadow operation. The American military moved quickly. Teams were sent across Germany, searching for scientists and engineers. Files were seized from abandoned research facilities. Scientists were interrogated, assessed, and given a choice: work for the United States or risk capture by the Soviet Union. Some went willingly, others hesitated. But in the end, the offer was clear: work for your former enemy or disappear into history. There was only one problem. Many of these scientists had direct ties to Nazi war crimes. Some had worked with the SS, some had designed weapons used in concentration camps, some had experimented on prisoners, human beings treated as test subjects. If the public found out, the backlash would be unthinkable. And so the US government took action. They removed Nazi affiliations from official records. They erased criminal histories. They rewrote the past, turning war criminals into valuable assets. Because in the race for power, history could be adjusted, the truth could be redacted, and men who once worked for the Third Reich could now serve under the Stars and Stripes. By the late 1940, hundreds of German scientists had been smuggled into the United States. They were given new identities, new jobs, new futures. They settled into American research facilities, military bases, and top-secret laboratories, and their work had already begun, because these weren't just any scientists. They were the men who would shape the next great era of warfare, shaping the future. The Cold War and the space race and the secrets of Operation Paperclip. The men who once built weapons for Hitler were now building technology for the United States. It was a shift that would change history. Because the scientists of Operation Paperclip weren't just working on ordinary research. They were shaping the future of warfare, intelligence, and space exploration. And their knowledge would push the world toward two defining battles of the modern age: the arms race, the space race. And in both, the United States was about to take the lead. One name stood above all the others: Wernher von Braun. Once a member of Hitler's elite scientists, von Braun had been instrumental in creating the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range ballistic missile, a weapon that had rained destruction on London during World War II, but in the hands of the Americans. His knowledge became something else. He was no longer a Nazi scientist, he was now an American engineer, and under his leadership, the US developed the rockets that would lead to NASA's Apollo program, the rockets that would carry astronauts to the moon, the rockets that would define America's victory in the space race. But the question remained: at what cost? The achievements of Operation Paperclip were undeniable. Breakthroughs in space exploration, advancements in missile technology, a head start in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. But in the pursuit of knowledge, something had been buried. The past, the truth, the real history of the men now working for the US government. For decades, the full details of Operation Paperclip remained classified. The American public was never told the full extent of who had been brought over or what they had done during the war, because some secrets were never meant to be uncovered. It wasn't until the 1990s that declassified documents revealed the full scope of Operation Paperclip. The files showed how Nazi scientists were protected, how their pasts were scrubbed clean, how men who had once worked for the SS, for Hitler's war machine, had been given a second life in the United States. And as the truth emerged, the question was asked again: had it been worth it? Had the scientific progress, the Cold War advantage, the space race victory justified working with war criminals? The answers remained as divided as history itself. For some, Operation Paperclip was a necessary evil. For others, it was a moral failure that could never be erased. The men of Operation Paperclip are gone now. The laboratories are silent. The Cold War is over. The rockets have long since launched into the sky. But the legacy remains, a reminder that history is never black and white, that in the world of intelligence, of war, of power, morality is often the first thing to disappear. The CIA's failed Pigeon camera spies? The Cold War was a war without battlefields. There were no trenches, no front lines, no official declarations of war. Instead, it was fought in the shadows, through whispered messages, through hidden cameras, through spies who moved unseen, gathering intelligence on the enemy. And in this endless game of deception, the United States was always looking for an advantage, an edge, a way to see without being seen, which is why in the late 1960s and 70s the CIA came up with an idea that was unconventional. If humans could not sneak behind enemy lines unseen, maybe something smaller could, something faster, something with wings. The CIA had long been fascinated by animals in espionage. They had tried using cats as listening devices. They had trained dolphins to spy on enemy submarines. They had experimented with insects carrying microphones. But this time, they turned to pigeons. Not just any pigeons, spy pigeons. The plan? Attach tiny cameras to the birds, send them flying over enemy territory, capture aerial surveillance photos without being detected. A simple, elegant idea, and, in theory, it should have worked. But the real world is never as simple as a classified document. And as the CIA soon discovered, spying with pigeons was far more complicated than they had imagined, engineering the impossible. The tiny cameras that changed everything, and a mission destined for failure. For the plan to work, the CIA needed more than just trained pigeons. They needed technology that had never been built before. A camera small enough to fit on a pigeon's chest. A lens sharp enough to capture detailed images from the sky. A mechanism light enough for a bird to carry without struggle. In the 1970s, miniaturized cameras were still a new concept. The technology was bulky, delicate, unreliable. But the CIA was determined. They designed a tiny automatic camera, a marvel of engineering for its time. It was strapped to the pigeon's body with a tiny harness, positioned to face downward, and as the pigeon flew, the camera would snap photos at timed intervals, capturing images of enemy territory below. It was a brilliant idea, and on paper, it should have worked. But there was another challenge. The pigeons needed to be trained. They had to fly long distances. They had to return to their handlers. They had to stay on course, no matter the conditions. Pigeons had been used as messengers in wartime for centuries, but this was different. They weren't carrying notes. They were carrying top-secret surveillance cameras, and no one had ever trained a bird for espionage before. The CIA developed special training programs. Pigeons were released from controlled locations to test their ability to return. They were sent over test sites to see if the cameras worked. They were conditioned to follow set flight paths. The results? Unpredictable. Some pigeons flew perfectly, capturing crisp, clear aerial images. Others went wildly off course. Some landed too soon, ruining the film, and a few never came back at all. The pigeons had their own ideas about how the mission should go, and most of the time, they didn't care about national security. Despite the challenges, the CIA moved forward. The pigeons were ready. The cameras were set. It was time for real missions, and that's when the problems really began. The missions were launched over high-security enemy sites. The pigeons were released. And what happened next was a lesson in chaos. Some pigeons flew in circles, never reaching their targets. Others landed on buildings, attracting attention from enemy guards. A few were attacked mid-air by hawks, disappearing entirely. One pigeon, carrying what the CIA believed was priceless intelligence, landed on a civilian's balcony. The camera was immediately noticed, and the pigeon was captured by someone who had no idea they were holding CIA technology. The bird was eventually released. The camera lost forever. After repeated failures, it became clear spy pigeons were not reliable. The program had cost millions of dollars, years of research, countless hours of training, and in the end, there was little to show for it. The CIA had tried to turn birds into secret agents, but pigeons, it turned out, had minds of their own, and no amount of intelligence work could change that. The legacy of spy pigeons, a footnote in history and the final flight of feathered spies. The CIA had spent years developing the pigeon spy program. They had invested in cutting-edge miniature cameras. They had trained birds with military precision. They had launched real-world missions, and yet, it had all amounted to almost nothing. Few usable photographs were ever recovered. The pigeons were unpredictable and unreliable. The project quietly faded away. Another Cold War experiment that never reached its full potential. For all its ingenuity, ambition, and secrecy, Operation Pigeon Camera was little more than a curious failure. By the 1980s, technology had already outpaced the need for pigeon spies. Satellites replaced aerial photography. Drones became a new tool for intelligence gathering. High-resolution cameras no longer needed birds to carry them. The world had moved forward. The pigeons, once considered potential secret weapons, were now just pigeons again. Looking back, the Pigeon Camera program was a reflection of Cold War paranoia, an era where no idea was too strange to be tested, a time when the US and the Soviet Union were so desperate for information that even birds were recruited as spies. The world would never know exactly how many missions failed, how many pigeons carried cameras, only to disappear into the sky, never returning, their secrets lost forever. And maybe, somewhere in an old archive, buried beneath layers of forgotten reports, there are still classified photographs taken by pigeons long ago, blurry, distorted, useless, yet proof that for a brief moment in history, the CIA truly believed that pigeons could win the Cold War. Operation Mongoose, the plot to sabotage Fidel Castro, the Cuban threat. The year was 1961. The world was changing. The Cold War was at its peak, and the United States was desperate to stop the spread of communism. And just 90 miles from Florida, an enemy had taken power. His name was Fidel Castro, a revolutionary, a leader, a symbol of defiance against the West. He had overthrown a US-backed government. He had allied himself with the Soviet Union. He had turned Cuba into a communist stronghold. For the American government, this could not stand. And so, in the shadowy halls of the CIA, a plan was born. A plan to destabilize Cuba, cripple its government, and eliminate its leader. They called it Operation Mongoose, a mission built on deception, sabotage, and assassination. But as history would soon show, not a single part of it would go according to plan. In November 1961, President John F. Kennedy approved Operation Mongoose. It was the most aggressive covert operation ever launched by the CIA. Hundreds of missions were planned. Millions of dollars were funneled into sabotage efforts. A team of spies, informants, and exiled Cubans were mobilized, and at the heart of it all, one goal remained: get rid of Castro, by any means necessary. The bizarre assassination attempts, poison, exploding seashells, and the mafia. The CIA's methods to eliminate Fidel Castro were anything but ordinary. The US government had hoped that something as simple as a well-placed bullet could put an end to Castro's reign, but the agency quickly realized that this might be a bit too direct. After all, Fidel Castro had become an icon, an enigma, a man who had survived failed attempts on his life before. So, the CIA, in its infinite creativity, began to develop a series of assassination plots that were so bizarre they bordered on the absurd. Some were scientific, others were psychological, and a few seemed like something straight out of a spy novel. The poisoned cigars. It all began with a plan so simple it almost seemed too good to be true. Poisoned cigars. In 1962, a plan was hatched to infect Castro's favorite cigars with a deadly toxin. The idea was that Fidel, a known cigar aficionado, would light up and consume the poison unknowingly. The CIA knew that Castro was a creature of habit, and the idea of using his own addiction against him was almost poetic. If he took one of these tainted cigars, it could bring his life to a quick end. The CIA had scientists design a substance that would incapacitate or kill him after consumption. They placed the toxin inside cigars and arranged for them to be delivered to Castro. However, just before the plot could be set in motion, it was derailed. Fidel Castro was wise to the plot. Word had gotten around that the CIA had been trying to kill him using poisoned cigars, and Castro was now highly cautious. As a result, the plan was rendered ineffective. The cigars were never used. But the CIA wasn't about to give up on getting rid of Castro. The exploding seashell, an ingenious plan gone wrong. Next came the exploding seashell. This was by far one of the most creative and strange assassination plots the CIA developed for Castro. The idea was simple. They would present Castro with a beautiful, rare seashell as a gift. What Castro didn't know was that this shell had been rigged with explosives. When he picked it up and examined it, he would be caught in The CIA believed that Castro would enjoy the beauty of the shell so much that he would hold it close, perhaps even to his ear. That was when the explosive would go off. However, as with many of the CIA's plots against Castro, things did not go according to plan. When the seashell was tested on an operative who was not Fidel Castro, it exploded prematurely, causing a massive risk to everyone involved. Fortunately, no one was hurt, but the operation was scrapped. It was a spectacular failure. Another example of the imagination behind the CIA's efforts, though it didn't seem to bring them any closer to their goal of eliminating Castro. The Mafia's involvement, a dangerous alliance. With their earlier attempts thwarted, the CIA began working closely with the Mafia, hoping to leverage their connections to Castro's underworld enemies. The Mafia had strong ties to Cuba before Castro's rise to power, and they saw his government as a threat to their operations. They wanted him gone as much as the CIA did. The CIA enlisted the help of infamous figures such as Johnny Rosselli and Santo Trafficante, who had influence in Cuba. These men were known to have connections to Castro's associates, and were thought to have access to avenues that could bypass normal security protocols. Several assassination attempts were planned through these mafia connections, ranging from poisoning Castro's food to creating a false narrative in order to discredit him in front of his people. But despite the careful planning and resources, Castro seemed to be always one step ahead. In fact, Castro's paranoia only increased with each assassination attempt, causing him to change his routine constantly. These unexpected twists ensured the CIA and Mafia's efforts would ultimately be thwarted, a wild ride of failed plots. As these attempts on Castro's life continued to grow more elaborate, some of the CIA's plans became almost comical. They went from attempting to use toxic needles hidden in a pen to plans involving exploding wetsuits and even contaminating his diving equipment. There were efforts to make Castro's beard fall out through the use of chemicals, hoping to humiliate him in front of his people. Some of these schemes seemed more like pranks than serious attempts at assassination. But, in the paranoid world of Cold War espionage, they were seen as necessary attempts in an all-out campaign to remove Castro from power. Despite their creativity and resources, the CIA's operation against Castro fell apart time and time again, and the many bizarre assassination plots ultimately ended in failure. Reflection and outcome. After years of failed attempts and mounting evidence that Castro could not be eliminated through traditional methods, the CIA began to see that their mission to destroy Castro was perhaps an unwinnable one. The operation became a lesson in the limits of covert operations and the dangers of becoming too focused on a single target. Though they couldn't rid Cuba of Castro, the CIA was forced to step back and reassess their approach, continuing to destabilize his government through other means. The outcome and reflection of Operation Mongoose and the legacy of a failed mission. By the late 1960s, Operation Mongoose had been in motion for nearly a decade. Hundreds of assassination attempts, millions of dollars spent, countless covert missions. And yet, Fidel Castro was still in power. The United States had thrown everything it had at removing him: plots, spies, sabotage. But nothing worked. The more they tried to eliminate him, the more his legend grew. Instead of appearing weak, Castro emerged stronger, defiant, untouchable. The CIA had not only failed, they had helped turn Castro into a symbol of survival. By the mid-1960s, Castro knew all about the CIA's attempts on his life. He even joked about it. In speeches, he would mock the United States, listing the many failed assassination plots with amusement. He knew about the poisoned cigars. He knew about the mafia's involvement. He knew about the exploding seashell. It was almost as if Castro had become invincible. Or at least, that's how the world saw him. Instead of being weakened, the assassination attempts only strengthened his public image. His supporters saw him as a man who could not be killed, a leader who had cheated death again and again. And in Cuba, that made him even more powerful. Operation Mongoose had been meant to topple Castro and weaken his government, but in the end, it became one of the CIA's greatest failures. The assassination attempts became public knowledge. The US government was caught engaging in unethical espionage. The entire operation became a Cold War embarrassment. By 1975, details about the CIA's activities began to surface. During US Senate investigations, evidence of covert assassination plots was exposed. The American public learned the truth. The US government had secretly plotted to kill foreign leaders. Millions had been spent on elaborate, absurd schemes. And despite all of it, Castro remained in power. It was a diplomatic disaster, and it left the CIA with a lesson they would never forget. Operation Mongoose faded into Cold War history, but its impact remained. It showed the extremes the US was willing to go to during the Cold War. It demonstrated the limits of covert operations. It created a myth around Fidel Castro as the man who could not be killed. And above all, it proved that even the most powerful intelligence agency in the world could still fail. Again, the heart attack gun, a silent assassination weapon. The Cold War was not just a war of nations, it was a war of secrets. A war where battles were fought not with soldiers on battlefields, but with whispers in dark rooms, hidden poisons, and assassins who left no trace. In this world, death had to be undetectable. A well-placed bullet could change history. A single word overheard could start a war. A spy uncovered could disappear without a sound. And in this shadowy game of deception and paranoia, one of the greatest weapons was silence. The ability to kill without leaving evidence. A weapon that could make a target simply fall over and die with no one suspecting foul play. This was the dream of intelligence agencies, and during the 1960s and 70s, the CIA believed they had found the perfect solution, a weapon designed to deliver instant death without a sound, without a trace, without a single mark on the body. They called it the heart attack gun. The ideal assassination is one that leaves the world asking no questions, no crime scene, no witnesses, No clear cause of death. Just a man clutching his chest, collapsing onto the pavement. A high-ranking official, a political enemy, a defector. Gone in an instant. Cause of death? A heart attack. No bullets, no stab wounds, no visible poison. Just one moment alive, and the next gone. For the CIA, this was the ultimate goal, a way to eliminate enemies without ever being blamed. And so, in the hidden corridors of classified research programs, they began developing a weapon that could make this nightmare a reality. The Cold War was a time of absolute paranoia. The US and the Soviet Union were locked in a silent war. Both sides were funding secret research into poisons, biological weapons, and psychological warfare. Assassination had become a political tool, used not just by spies, but by governments themselves. By the 1960s, CIA was deeply involved in covert operations around the world. They had overthrown governments in South America. They had tried, and failed, to assassinate Fidel Castro multiple times. They had secretly tested LSD and mind control experiments on their own citizens. Now they wanted a weapon that could be used anywhere, on anyone, without consequences. Something that wouldn't raise suspicion. And so, in the hidden depths of their research facilities, they began work on a gun that could fire death itself. It was an engineering challenge like no other. The weapon had to be silent, the ammunition had to be invisible, the kill had to be instant. The result? A small, modified handgun, no larger than a standard pistol, but instead of bullets, it fired a frozen dart. The dart was almost microscopic. Smaller than a grain of rice, it was coated in a powerful toxin, leaving to be shellfish poison. Once fired, it would melt into the bloodstream, leaving no visible entry wound. When the dart struck, the victim would feel only a tiny pinprick, if they felt anything at all. Seconds later, their heart would stop, and by the time medical examiners arrived, there would be no trace of the attack, just a heart that had mysteriously failed, a death that could never be proven as murder, the perfect assassination, or so the CIA thought. The heart attack gun was one of many secret weapons being developed during this time. The Soviet Union was also experimenting with poison-tipped umbrellas and chemical assassinations. The CIA was exploring biological weapons that could be disguised as everyday objects. Both sides were obsessed with finding ways to kill invisibly. Espionage was no longer about guns and knives. It was about who could make their enemies disappear the fastest, without anyone knowing how. The heart attack gun was the CIA's most audacious attempt to win this silent war, a weapon that could kill without war, without blame, without a trace. But as history would soon show, it was a secret that could not stay hidden forever, the weapon that was never meant to exist, exposing the heart attack gun and a scandal in the shadows. For years, the heart attack gun was nothing more than a whispered rumor. Only a handful of people knew it existed. It had been designed, tested, and locked away in the depths of CIA secrecy. But in 1975, everything changed. Because in that year, the United States government launched a historic investigation into intelligence abuses. And in a shocking moment of public exposure, the heart attack gun was revealed to the world. By the mid-1970s, public trust in the U.S. government was at an all-time low. The Vietnam War had divided the nation. The Watergate scandal had exposed corruption at the highest levels. And now Congress was looking into the CIA's darkest secrets. Senator Frank Church led an investigation into covert intelligence operations, determined to expose illegal activities and secret assassination programs. What the committee found was more disturbing than anyone expected. Government-backed coups, mind control experiments on unwitting citizens, and an arsenal of weapons designed for covert assassinations. But the moment that truly shocked the world was when the CIA's heart attack gun was shown to the public for the first time. It was a quiet day in Washington, D.C. The committee room was packed with officials, reporters, and intelligence operatives. A former CIA operative was called to testify, and as he stood before the panel, a single object was placed on the table before him. A small, unassuming pistol. the heart attack gun. For the first time, the world saw the weapon that was never meant to exist. The room fell silent as the weapon was described in detail. It fired frozen darts, laced with deadly poison. The darts melted into the bloodstream, leaving no evidence. The victim would suffer a fatal heart attack, completely undetectable. The committee members were visibly shaken. This wasn't a weapon from a spy novel. It was real, and for years it had been kept in the shadows. The revelation of the heart attack gun sent shockwaves through the nation. Had the CIA used it in real assassinations? Were political enemies or foreign leaders secretly eliminated? How many other unknown weapons were still hidden in the dark? The committee demanded answers, but the CIA's response was as cold as the weapon itself. They refused to confirm if the gun had ever been used. They denied involvement in any targeted assassinations. They insisted that it was merely experimental. But to the American public, that wasn't good enough. The heart attack gun became a symbol of Cold War paranoia, proof that the government had gone too far in its quest for power. And though the weapon itself was supposedly decommissioned, the fear remained. Had it already been used? Was it still being used? Or had new, even deadlier weapons replaced it? The truth, as always, remained hidden. The legacy of the heart attack gun, fact, fiction, and fear, and drifting into the shadows. The CIA's heart attack gun was supposedly decommissioned, locked away, forgotten. But was it really? Even after the 1975 hearings, the world was left with more questions than answers. Did the CIA ever actually use it? Were political leaders secretly assassinated with it? Had it already been replaced with something even deadlier? The official records told one story, but the whispers told another. And in the world of intelligence, where secrecy is the most powerful weapon, the truth is never easy to find. The heart attack gun became more than just a weapon. It became a symbol, a reminder of how far governments were willing to go to eliminate threats. A weapon designed to kill without leaving a trace. Was proof that the Cold War wasn't just fought with spies and secrets. It was fought with fear itself. What other weapons had been developed in the shadows? What classified programs were still hidden from the public? How many deaths that seemed natural were really something else? The heart attack gun showed that assassination was no longer a crime of passion. It was a science, cold, precise, and terrifyingly effective. Over the decades, the heart attack gun has remained a topic of speculation. Some believe it was used in secret assassinations. Others claim it was just one of many hidden CIA weapons. And some say it was merely a psychological tool designed to make America's enemies paranoid, always wondering if their heart might stop at any moment. The truth? Like so many things in the world of intelligence, it remains classified. The Cold War ended, but covert operations never stopped. If the heart attack gun existed in the 1970s, what kind of weapons exist today? Drones that can eliminate a target from thousands of miles away? Poisons that vanish from the body in hours? Nanotechnology that can manipulate the human body at a cellular level? The methods may have changed, but the goal remains the same. Silent assassinations. Deaths that leave no questions, no trace, just like the heart attack gun was meant to do. And as you close your eyes, know that some truths will always be hidden, because in the world of intelligence, the most powerful weapons are the ones no one believes exist. The CIA's use of psychics, Project Stargate. The Cold War was not just a battle of weapons and technology. It was a battle for information, a war where spies and secrets could determine the fate of nations. And as the United States and the Soviet Union raced to gain the upper hand, some believed that the greatest weapon was not in machines, but in the human mind. What if a spy could see into enemy bases without ever being there? What if classified documents could be read through sheer mental focus? What if war could be fought with psychic powers alone? It sounds like science fiction. But for decades, the CIA and the US government believed it was possible, and they were willing to spend millions of dollars to find out. This is the story of Project Stargate, the CIA's secret experiment to turn psychics into spies. In the 1970s, agencies became obsessed with a terrifying possibility. What if the Soviet Union was already using psychic spies? Reports suggested the KGB was funding secret psychic research. Rumors spread that Soviet psychics could see American missile bases. Some even claimed they could control minds from a distance. The CIA couldn't afford to ignore it. If the Soviets had psychic weapons, then the US needed psychic defenses. And so, in the deepest corners of intelligence research, a classified project was born. Its mission? To find, train, and weaponize real-life psychics. It was called Project Stargate. The first step was finding the right people. The CIA needed individuals with extraordinary abilities, those who claimed to have visions, premonitions, or the power to see beyond reality. They searched through military records looking for soldiers who had unexplained intuitions in battle. They studied psychics who performed in carnivals and sideshows. They even consulted mystics, fortune-tellers, and self-proclaimed prophets. One by one, they gathered those who claimed to have the gift, and inside a secretive military lab, the experiments began. The goal? To determine if psychic abilities were real or just a fantasy. The tests were simple at first. A psychic would sit in a dark room. A CIA officer in another location would hold up a hidden object. The psychic would attempt to see it using only their mind. Their descriptions were recorded and analyzed. Some got everything wrong, but a few got it right. And that was all the CIA needed. They had proof, at least enough proof to justify further research. Project Stargate was officially underway, and soon, the experiments would become far more ambitious. Remote viewing, spying with the mind, missions of the psychic spies. The CIA's experiments with psychic abilities had produced mixed results. Some participants failed entirely, seeing nothing but darkness. But a select few seemed to have a strange gift. They could describe hidden objects, name places they had never been, and even see inside classified locations. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't always reliable, but it was enough to push the program to the next stage. A new experiment, a new technique, they called it. Remote viewing. The idea behind remote viewing was simple. A person would sit in a dark, quiet room. They would enter a deep meditative state. A target location, somewhere far away, would be assigned to them. Using only their mind, they would describe what they saw. If this worked, it meant that spies wouldn't need cameras, satellites, or informants. They could simply see inside enemy bases from thousands of miles away. And incredibly, some of them could. One of the first real missions assigned to the psychic spies involved a top-secret Soviet facility. The CIA had no satellite images of the site. No spies had ever been inside. No one in US intelligence knew what was happening there. So, in a last attempt to gather intelligence, they turned to a psychic, a remote viewer. They gave him a set of coordinates, nothing else. He sat in a darkened room, closed his eyes, began to concentrate. And then he started describing something. A large metallic structure, a tall cylindrical shape, unlike any known building, men in white lab coats walking around it. The CIA didn't know what to make of it, but months later, when satellite images finally became available, the psychic had been correct. The structure was real, a secret Soviet nuclear weapons facility, and it was exactly as he had described. Was it a coincidence? Was it just guesswork? Or had this psychic truly seen something beyond the limits of the human mind? No one could be sure. But the results were compelling enough for the CIA to keep going. Remote viewing was no longer just an experiment. It was becoming a real tool for espionage. With their newfound confidence, the CIA began assigning psychic spies to more ambitious missions. They searched for hidden missile bases. They attempted to locate hostages. They tried to track enemy submarines. Using only the power of the mind, some of the reports were eerily accurate. Others were wildly wrong. But the mere possibility that psychic spying could work was enough to keep the project alive. And with every success, the government became more convinced. that psychic abilities might be the next frontier of intelligence gathering. The decline of psychic espionage and the truth about Project Stargate. For years, Project Stargate had operated in the deepest shadows of U.S. intelligence. It had received millions of dollars in funding. It had gathered classified intelligence reports. It had attracted the attention of top military officials. And yet, doubt was beginning to grow. Some remote viewing results were stunning. Others were completely unreliable, and no one could explain why it worked sometimes and failed at other times. Was psychic spying a real tool, or had the CIA simply been chasing a fantasy? The answer was becoming harder to ignore. By the 1980s and early 1990s, the US government was becoming less willing to invest in psychic research. More advanced satellite technology was now providing real-time intelligence. Surveillance, drones, and electronic spying tools were proving far more reliable. Many within the intelligence community began to view Project Stargate as nothing more than pseudoscience. The skeptics wanted proof. They demanded scientific testing, and when the results came back, the truth was clear. Some remote viewers showed remarkable accuracy, but overall, the results were too inconsistent. There was no repeatable scientific proof that psychic espionage actually worked. It was no longer a matter of national security. It was a matter of credibility. And in 1995, the decision was made. After more than 20 years, Project Stargate was officially shut down. For decades, the psychic spy program had been one of the CIA's most closely guarded secrets. But in 1995, the US government declassified much of its research. For the first time, the world learned that the CIA had spent millions on psychic research. Dozens of military psychics had been assigned to real-world missions. The government had at one time truly believed that remote viewing might work. It sounded too bizarre to be true. And yet, the documents proved it had happened. Even after its closure, Project Stargate left behind lingering mysteries. Did the program ever uncover classified intelligence that was never made public? Were successful psychic spies recruited into even more secretive projects? And if remote viewing really was fake, why had the government invested in it for over 2 decades? The answers remain unknown. Perhaps they always will, because in the world of intelligence, some secrets are meant to stay hidden. And as you drift into sleep, remember that even the most unbelievable stories are sometimes true. Operation Acoustic Kitty, the CIA's attempt at spy cats. The Cold War was not just a battle of missiles and spies. It was a war of ideas. Nations raced to develop the most advanced weapons. Intelligence agencies sought new ways to eavesdrop on the enemy. Every innovation, no matter how strange, was considered a potential advantage. And in the corridors of the CIA, a radical new idea was taking shape. If human spies were too easy to detect, why not use animals? One of the biggest challenges in Cold War espionage was getting close to enemy targets without being noticed. Planted microphones could be discovered. Human agents were always at risk of being caught. Electronic surveillance was still in its infancy. The CIA needed a way to listen in on Soviet conversations without raising suspicion, and so, deep inside a classified research program, a bold experiment was launched. A plan to turn ordinary animals into listening devices. And their first test subject? A cat. The idea was simple, at least on paper. Cats were small and agile. They could move through cities without suspicion. They often roamed near embassies, military bases, and high-security locations. What if a cat could be equipped with a microphone and used to listen in on secret conversations? It would be the perfect spy. It would go undetected, blending into the environment. It would collect valuable intelligence, and no one would suspect a thing. This was the vision of Operation Acoustic Kitty, but making it a reality? That was something else entirely. Turning a living animal into a surveillance device was not easy. A microphone had to be small enough to fit inside the cat's body. A radio transmitter had to be hidden under its fur. The cat had to be trained to approach targets without acting suspicious. It was an engineering challenge unlike anything the CIA had attempted before, and as the research began, the problems quickly became clear. How do you implant a microphone without harming the cat? How do you make sure the cat doesn't scratch or damage the device? And most importantly, how do you get a cat to follow orders? The CIA had embarked on one of its strangest scientific projects yet, and despite the odds, they were determined to make it work. The science of a spy cat. Engineering the impossible and training the feline agent, the CIA had turned to science in an attempt to make its bizarre vision a reality. This wasn't just about training a cat. It was about modifying it. A miniature microphone had to be implanted inside the cat's body. A tiny radio transmitter had to be hidden beneath its fur. A thin wire antenna had to be woven along the length of its tail. All of this had to be done without harming the cat or affecting its movements. It was a task that pushed the limits of 1960s technology, and after months of research, trial and error, the CIA successfully implanted the first spy equipment into a living cat. The cat survived the surgery, which was an accomplishment in itself. The microphone was hidden inside its ear canal. The transmitter was placed beneath layers of skin. The antenna was disguised as part of its tail. At first glance, the cat looked completely normal, but beneath its fur, it was now a walking surveillance device. The technology worked. The real problem? The cat had no interest in being a spy. If the CIA had picked a dog, things might have been different. Dogs could be trained. Dogs could follow commands. Dogs were loyal. But cats do whatever they want. They don't follow orders. They don't care about Cold War politics. Still, the CIA pressed forward. They trained the cat to recognize voices and walk toward conversations. They experimented with food rewards to keep it on track. They tried conditioning it to move on command, but the cat remained stubbornly independent. Sometimes it followed orders. Other times it wandered off. Most of the time, it just ignored the CIA operatives entirely. Controlling a cat's behavior, they soon realized, was nearly impossible. But the project had gone too far to be abandoned. And so, after months of training, the CIA prepared the world's first surveillance cat for its first real mission. The CIA selected a high-value target, a pair of Soviet officials known for having private conversations outdoors. The plan was simple. The spy cat would be released near the officials. It would approach them naturally as if it were just another stray cat. The hidden microphone would pick up their conversation. The team had spent years preparing for this moment. And then, the operation began. The surveillance team parked their van a short distance away. The cat was released onto the street. It took a few hesitant steps forward, and then, within seconds, a passing taxi ran it over. Instantly. The CIA agents sat in stunned silence. Years of research, millions of dollars, months of training, all gone in an instant. Operation Acoustic Kitty had ended before it even started. The end of Operation Acoustic Kitty, a lesson in espionage failure and the legacy of spy animals. The CIA agents sat in stunned silence. The mission had lasted less than a minute. Years of effort, millions of dollars, cutting-edge technology. And yet, the world's first cybernetic spy cat had been taken out by a random taxi before it even reached its target. No intelligence had been gathered, no conversations had been recorded, no enemy secrets had been exposed. All that remained was the undeniable truth. Operation Acoustic Kitty had been a complete disaster. Back at CIA headquarters, officials had a difficult choice to make. Should they try again with another cat? Should they refine the technology and improve training? Or should they finally accept that cats were never meant to be spies? In the end, logic prevailed. The cost was too high, the technology was unreliable, and, most importantly, cats simply didn't care about espionage. And so, after 5 years of research, the CIA officially shut down Operation Acoustic Kitty. The experiment was quietly abandoned. Classified documents were locked away, and the spy cat became a forgotten footnote in Cold War history. Despite its failure, Operation Acoustic Kitty was not the end of animal espionage. The military continued to experiment with dolphins trained to detect underwater mines. The CIA studied pigeons equipped with tiny cameras for aerial surveillance. Scientists explored using insects with implanted microchips for reconnaissance. But if there was one lesson learned from Operation Acoustic Kitty, it was this: you can train a spy, you can build a machine, but you can never make a cat do something it doesn't want to do. Imagine a world where for a brief moment in history, the CIA truly believed that a cat could change the course of the Cold War. Because sometimes, even the strangest stories are true. The fine line between genius and absurdity. Closing thoughts. For decades, the CIA has operated in the shadows, crafting elaborate plots that blur the line between genius and absurdity. Some of their covert operations changed the course of history, while others fell apart before they even began, victims of miscalculation, betrayal, or simply the limits of reality. Yet in the world of espionage, even failure serves a purpose, pushing the boundaries of what is possible, no matter how strange the attempt may seem. Throughout this journey, we've uncovered some of the CIA's most bizarre and ambitious missions. A tunnel beneath Berlin, painstakingly constructed to tap Soviet communications, only to be compromised before the first wire was even laid. A fake Hollywood sci-fi film, complete with posters, scripts, and a fully staffed production company, all designed as a cover for smuggling diplomats out of Iran. A secret arms race that extended beyond weapons and technology into the human mind. Psychic spies trained to see across continents, tasked with locating nuclear silos and enemy submarines without ever leaving a dimly lit room. A weapon engineered to kill without a trace, a simple dart that could cause a heart attack and dissolve, leaving behind no evidence of murder. Each of these operations sounds like fiction, and yet every one of them was real. Funded, developed, and executed with the full force of one of the most powerful intelligence agencies in the world. And if these are the stories that have been declassified, one can only imagine the secrets that remain buried in classified documents, hidden away in archives where only a select few will ever read them. How many other projects were erased from history before they could be uncovered? What covert missions are still unfolding in the shadows, just beyond the reach of public knowledge? The answers may never come, because in the world of intelligence, some stories are never meant to be told. They are sealed away, lost to time, fading like echoes in an empty room. But that's the nature of secrecy. It is designed to disappear, leaving only the faintest traces behind. And so, as you drift into sleep, let the past fade with you. Let the world of secret missions, hidden tunnels, and forgotten experiments dissolve into the darkness. Somewhere, in a file buried deep within a government archive, another mystery waits to be uncovered. But for now, let the unknown remain unknown.